about variation and the different ways that we can change allele frequencies. So remember, an allele is just a version of a gene. I always use poker chips to explain alleles, okay? And again, like we just talked about, we're diploid for all of these different things, okay? We have a version of each gene from mom and a version of each gene from dad, okay? So you can have two of the same alleles, or you can have two different alleles, okay? But in our population, right, we're gonna look at all of the different alleles that our organisms possess, okay? So if we have lots of homozygous dominant individuals, then we're going to have lots of that version of the trait, that dominant version of the trait in our gene pool. Whereas if we have a lot of heterozygotes, like we just talked about in our population, then we might have a more even split between dominant and recessive alleles, okay, or dominant and recessive traits that can then be passed on to offspring. So here are the reasons why an allele frequency might change, and there's a lot of vocab here, so this is definitely some important stuff to write down, okay? So number one, natural selection, we've already talked about. If the environment changes, the amount of alleles in that population are going to change. Okay, so if we go back to a simple example like the mice with their different coloring, and we have lots of homozygous dominant mice that are a darker color, and all of a sudden the environment starts to get lighter, then we're going to see less of the dominant alleles in the population because these guys are going to be dying, they're going to be eaten, or they're going to no longer be able to reproduce. And then we might see some more recessive alleles sneaking into the population because that's what's beneficial with the environment at that time. Okay, so we'll definitely be able to see shifts in whether or not we have dominant or recessive alleles in a population because of the environment and natural selection. Second, and we already talked about this, but mutations are definitely a contributor to having changes in allele frequencies, just because you're mutating or you're changing the DNA of that individual, and so that could provide an entirely different version of that gene, like something that we have never seen before. So that's definitely going to lead to a change. The next two, gene flow and genetic drift, are really, really important contributors to allele frequencies. And they're also something that my students get mixed up because, again, they both start with G, but they're very different. So make sure you're paying attention to what the words are saying and spend some time learning the difference because they're actually going to have very different effects on the population. So number three, gene flow. It sounds like what it is. So genes are flowing into and out of the population. If you think about like immigration or emigration, that's a perfect example of gene flow. For humans, our gene flow is off the charts because we can hop on a plane and go to a whole different country and start a family there. And now our genes and whatever traits that we have by being Americans, right, have, and from our great ancestors, are now mixing with another gene pool from a different area. When one organism from one population joins another population, and it's going to make that population usually more diverse or have more variation. Okay. And again, it's because wherever they're coming from, they may have had a different environment or different selective pressures or just a different mating pool. There were different options for them to mate with. And so when they're joining a new population, they're going to be contributing that into that group's gene pool. So gene flow is awesome, and it's going to increase genetic variation for the most part, okay, which is definitely an important distinction. Genetic drift, on the other hand, is going to be a chance event. This is another important thing to write down, is going to be a chance event that greatly decreases the size of a population, okay? When you decrease the size of a population, you are innately going to decrease the amount of genetic variation in that population, okay? The way that I explain it sometimes is think about if all of a sudden something crazy happens to our Earth and there were 10 people left that had to populate the entire Earth again, right? There is a lot less variation in those 10 people than in the 7+ billion people that we have on Earth. right? So the variation in the new population of humans on Earth is going to be much, much smaller than what we had prior to said catastrophe. Okay, so there are two different ways that that can manifest. So these next two are both examples of genetic drift. One is called the bottleneck effect, and one is called the founder effect. So bottleneck effect is an example like what I just talked about. If the Earth, some crazy something meteor hit the Earth and only 10 people were left, that would be an example of the bottleneck effect. So here's a graphic, and I think I have it on the next slide. But you can see a lot of variation in our starting population, and then only a few people. They always show it through the neck of a bottle because it illustrates that only a few are going to survive whatever catastrophic event it is, are going to remain. And then that is the only variation that we will see in the offspring. Okay, so we started with a relatively diverse population, and we're ending up with a relatively same unanimous population of just blues and yellows in this case, because only a few survived, and that is the only genes and the only traits that we have that can be passed on. Okay. The second example of genetic drift, and remember that both of these are due to usually chance, some sort of chance event that's greatly decreasing the population. The founder effect is exactly what it sounds like. So you have a group from a starting population, they're circled over here, that moves, goes somewhere else. Maybe they're island hopping, they go find a new island to live on. This is like what happened with Darwin's finches. They just decided that the grass was greener somewhere else. And those small group of individuals are the only genes, whatever genes they have, are the only genes that are going to be seen in the new population that they form on their new island or their new wherever they decide to go. Okay, so in both of those, you have a very small subset of a larger population that are then responsible for reproducing, and they are innately going to have less variation than the starting population. So as a rule, genetic drift will greatly decrease variation in a population, whereas gene flow, again, that movement of alleles into a population will actually increase your variation. Okay. Last one for changes in allele frequencies is non-random mating. And that goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with like sexual selection. Non-random mating just means that you are having a choice in your mate, okay? On the flip side, which is kind of the easiest way to describe non-random mating, completely random mating means that whoever you bump into is your mate, right? That doesn't happen. It's a good thing, right? So we have choice, and so do almost every species on Earth. They will choose who their mate is, okay? And because of that, there are certain traits that are going to just be more favorable and be propagated more frequently. All right, just really quick. Between two populations, though, gene flow, let me just answer this real quick question about gene flow. So between two populations, gene flow decreases variation, right? So as a whole, gene flow usually is going to increase variation between populations. I guess I don't fully understand your question, because so if you take one individual from, let's say, wherever you live, so Chicago would be my example, and then you move them to somewhere in Africa, right? The genes that you're bringing are going to be very different than the genes that already exist in that population in Africa. And therefore, when you reproduce, if you reproduce with people in that area, you are increasing the variation because you are adding your genes into that mix. Does that make sense, Tommaso? Hopefully it does. Okay. Cool. I'm going to move on then to our next slide. But again, just remember, anytime that you're throwing in genes from a different population into another population, you're going to be increasing the variation there just because you're adding new things that they might not have already had. Okay, there are my lovely pictures. Look, I could have been doing this the whole time and not showing you my little word wall. But just a reminder, and now you should have access to this with the bottleneck and with your ancestral population. I like that example of founder effect because you see that only 2 of the original 3 starting colors of butterflies make it onto the new island, which means they've completely lost that white butterfly trait, and therefore will not have that in their new founding population. It should be up in a second for you to answer. All right, it's up there for you. All right, it looks like we've all honed in on the answer being C. Yeah, so with genetic drift, so remember A and B would be a really great example of gene flow, immigration and emigration, okay? But genetic drift is when we have that chance event that is going to cause those significant changes due to the fact that the population is just a lot smaller. You can always think back to my end of the world example for that one. Let's be question 3. Poll is up there whenever you're ready. All right, you guys are too good. Looks like most of you found your answer or your way to the answer choice B. So remember, genetic drift is going to be some sort of event in which we have a much smaller population with different traits in it. And then the big giveaway here was the second part of that answer, which was founder's effect, because we have this group. Oh, what is founder effect? So founder effect is when you have a small group of people that are literally going and founding a new area in which they're going to start a new population. If you think about Darwin's finches and those birds going off onto a new island, that would be another good example of founder effect. So it's just a small group from a starting population, there's less variation in that population, and they're going off to find a new home, and then they're reproducing there. So I saw, I think someone had picked, we had a couple other answer choices. So I can tell you why the others are not going to be correct. So when you're talking about natural selection, so answer choice C, whatever trait that you're seeing, it has to give that individual an advantage in their environment. And as far as we know, there's no advantage to having this blue skin. It's also not going to be a bottleneck because the original population wasn't decimated, it wasn't killed off. They just left from a starting group. Sexual selection and mutations, for as far as we know, there's no one that's selecting to just mate with blue-skinned people. That's not explicitly clear. And there's no necessarily example of a mutation occurring within this smaller population. So that's not necessarily a completely wrong answer. So this is something that you kind of have to get used to with AP Bio or any AP class. They do this fun thing where it's like there's an answer that's right-ish, and then there's an answer that's definitely right or most correct. It's the same thing on the SAT. If you guys are familiar with taking the SAT, there is just a better or more correct answer, and it usually goes back to the one that's more simple, the one that you have to make less like extraneous connections to. Genetic equilibrium is meaning that everything would be even. So equilibrium is always going to be some sort of even baseline. And I don't see this happening here because blue skin is definitely not our equilibrium for humans. So hopefully that helps clear up